Yeah. Family, y'all. Just keep it tight, keep it tight, keep it tight. Oh, right. Yeah. Here we go.
The next period in our study we know as the Feudal period to the East-West split. So this covers roughly from the years 500 AD to the East-West split in 1054. The title of this chapter in Paul Bernier's work is The Monastery as Minister. So this focus on how it is that in the monasteries we're going to be growing this new breed of ministers and the impact that that will have on our church. So we know that by the end of the 5th century, by the end of the 400s, the Roman Empire had completely fallen, had completely collapsed. By 486, there was no longer an emperor in the West. So in the empire, which previously was centered in Rome, we know that the empire was transferred to Constantinople. And so now this Constantinople-centered empire, or the Byzantine Empire, is what the Roman Empire was before. It's now centered out of Constantinople. There was no longer then an emperor in the West. The emperor was over in Constantinople. What does that mean then? That there was a power struggle between the Patriarch of Rome now and the Patriarch of Constantinople and also the Emperor of Byzantium. How interesting it will be, because here in the East we know that since the emperor is in the East, the church will be under and subject to the emperor, whereas what's happening here in the West, there is a vacuum that's left. After the empire moved out of Italy to Constantinople, there's now this vacuum of power in the West, and that, as we saw in our course on church history, was filled by the Pope, by the Bishop of Rome. In 486, on Christmas Day of 486, Clovis, the king of the Franks, and the new Constantine was baptized on Christmas Day, and thus entered a new power struggle. Because now we have Clovis, the king of the Franks, who's going to closely align with the Bishop of Rome against these other forces in the East. Stephen II was the Patriarch of Rome. This is now 754. And in 754 then, Stephen II would sever the link with the Patriarch, between the Patriarch of Rome and the Emperor of Constantinople, creating essentially then this axis of power between the Bishop of Rome and the Franks and the British Isles, so that from Britain to Rome then would be one axis of power, and then the Byzantine Empire would be another axis of power. So this Rome-France axis was created after Stephen II then named Pippin the Younger Patricius Romanorum, which simply meant the protector and defender of the Romans. So how interesting that Pippin the Younger of the Franks now would be the ones that the Romans would look to for protection rather than those in the East. If a problem happens, if we were to be invaded again by barbarians, would we be appealing to Constantinople and to the emperor there? No. We now have an alliance with Pippin the Younger and the Franks. On Christmas Day of 800, Pope Leo III, the Patriarch of Rome at that time, is going to crown Charlemagne. To his surprise, how interesting that Charlemagne on Christmas Day of 800 was crowned emperor in Rome. So the Roman Empire had moved out of Rome and was now centered in Constantinople, but now in the year 800, we're now going to have an emperor in the West. Who is the emperor crowned by? Crowned by Pope Leo III. So interestingly, we see this new relationship between state and church, where the emperor in the West of the new Holy Roman Empire was crowned by the Pope. What else is happening? If we remember back to our course on church history, Islam was expanding at breakneck speed, says Paul Bernier, expanding across Africa, and soon it will come up into the peninsula, into Spain. And also it was cutting off the communication between the East and the West. So what's happening is that we have this axis of power in the west, we have the old empire in the east to which the church is subject, and we're going to see how it is that this distance is growing between the two. The definitive split then came in 1054, where the west and the east were divided. If we remember our course in church history, it was over a few key issues: leavened bread, a celibate clergy, and also the Roman Church's tinkering with our creed. So the Roman Church tampered with our creed. They added a word to the creed, the word filioque, and the Son. They added and they changed our creed without our permission. That was a grievous fault that led to our split. Also, the Roman Church mandated celibacy. Celibacy was nothing that was ever held in esteem in the Eastern Church in the same way as in the West. And so another issue over which we split was celibacy. But also we know that in the Western Church we continue today to use unleavened bread. That was an issue. If you go to any Eastern church today, the Orthodox Catholic Church, the Greek Orthodox Catholic Church, the Roman Orthodox Catholic Church, they all used leavened bread. Now we had in the West this split where they were using unleavened bread in their liturgies. So it would be in 1054 that split would definitively happen then between the East and the West. What was happening in terms of ministry during this period? We have, first of all, the rise of monasteries. So Benedict, we said that this period goes from 500 to 1054 AD. It was in 529 that Benedict of Nursia founded a monastery at Monte Cassino. So Benedict founds one monastery. He has various monks who gather around him, and they're living a certain life. And that model of life would quickly expand throughout Europe, such that they expanded to some 17,000 abbeys throughout Europe. Imagine that for a moment, 17,000 monasteries which produced 24 popes, 200 cardinals, 1,600 bishops, 43 emperors, 44 kings, 1,560 saints, and over 5,000 blesseds. Think about the impact of this system of monasteries for a moment. So what's happening is that out of these 17,000 monasteries throughout Europe then, we're now producing 24 popes for the church, 24 monk popes who will be imposing on the church their way of life, including celibacy, 200 cardinals, 1,600 bishops. That's a lot of church leadership coming out of monasteries, but also civil leadership with 43 emperors and 44 kings, and then also the models that we're going to be looking to for life in the church for the sake of our own spirituality, with 1,560 saints and 5,000 blesseds. Who are we looking to as models of holiness in the church? We're looking at these saints and these blesseds who came where? Out of monasteries. So how interesting that one monk pope profoundly changed the church during this time period, and that was Saint Gregory the Great. So Pope Gregory the First was the Bishop of Rome from 590 to 604, and during those 14 years, Gregory then was simply taking what he knew as a monk and now diffusing that throughout the church that he was leading. The other monk pope that's significant during this time period was Gregory the Seventh. So Gregory the Great was Gregory the First. Now by the time we get to Gregory the Seventh, the year is 1073 to 1085, when he served as pope, and we'll see how it is that these two monk popes profoundly changed the future course of the church. So with 17,000 monasteries throughout Europe, As you can imagine, what happens in monasteries, all of these people are living common life together, and they're dividing various responsibilities, such that, for instance, Terry might be in charge of the agricultural tasks of the monastery, and Rafaela might be in charge of the farm, the cheese making, and all that we do there. We're dividing up all of these tasks among all of the monks or among all of the nuns, and we're beginning to organize many resources. We've often said that power comes from one of two places, from organized people and or from organized resources like money. What were we doing in the monasteries? In the monasteries we were organizing people, and we were dividing our tasks among those people so that we were in turn bringing in great economic resources to our monasteries as well. Just imagine for a moment, if we organized ourselves so that we had agricultural products more than what we needed to sustain ourselves, and if we had more cheese than what we need, what would happen then? We would start selling them off, and we would have income for ourselves as a monastery. So these monasteries grew in resources such that by organizing people and money, the abbots and abbesses, the heads of these monasteries, were often more powerful than the bishops in their areas. Imagine that for a moment. How nice to be a bishop, but wait a minute, look over at the monastery, see how it is that they've organized people and resources? They were actually more powerful, those abbots and abbesses in the monasteries, because of their ability to be able to organize people and resources in a more effective way than the bishops of that time. Many of the bishops during that time had previously been monks. So what does that mean? When you have 1,600 bishops who are formed in the monasteries, it means that they're going to be influenced by that formation that they themselves received, such that how are they going to lead over others? It will be largely be influenced by the formation that they received as monks. By 814, church councils were urging the spirit and practices of the monks on all clergy. So how interesting that by 814, we see how it is that these monk popes like Gregory I, Gregory the Great, who reigned from 590 to 604, their ideas had so infiltrated the church that priests now were expected to live really like monks. They were expected to live, for instance, celibate lives. They were expected to live without great amounts of resources, to follow in the evangelical way of living in poverty. And so, for instance, it was in 1074 that Gregory VII, or Hildebrand we know him as, that he tried to enforce vows of poverty for all clergy. How interesting. So we have this movement then toward celibacy in the Western Church throughout Europe with this spread of monasteries, but also we have the spread of poverty, which now in 1074, with the reign of Gregory VII, is being mandated on all priests. All priests, regardless of who you are, who are subject to the Western Church, the Patriarch of Rome, then, all of them are starting to live the lives of monks. What does this mean for married clergy? We'll soon see how it is that married clergy will be suppressed in the Roman Catholic Church. What a sad moment in our lives when all of these people are coming out of monasteries and insisting that others live the lives that they live. We're soon going to see how it is that these monk popes and all of these people coming out of the monasteries are going to try to make others into monks as well, including the priests of the church. How it is that all priests should be living like monks. The monks then had a vow of celibacy and a vow of poverty. We also know that they had a vow of obedience. Obedience was very important in the church, but also in the monastery. If we're going to organize ourselves then, it would help if we were all obedient rather than being rebellious spirits questioning what our superiors said to us. So obedience was important in monasteries as it was in the church. But then the other aspect of their life that was important was this vow of stability. When you became a monk, you committed yourself to that monastery and to that community. But how interesting. What happens though, when so many people come to our monastic way of living in this monastery, we see to ourselves that wouldn't it be nice if we multiplied and we started another community in another place? Here we have this nice monastery in Austin. What if we were to found another monastic community in San Marcos? Or another one in Georgetown? How it is that these monasteries then are going to begin multiplying, so that even despite this vow of stability, monks were vowing themselves to live in one place, how it is that the monks became great missionaries in the church. Because we had this organized way of life, and we began to replicate it. We took this monastic community in Austin, and we replicated it in San Marcos. And we replicated it in Georgetown. The monks became tremendous missionaries, spreading their lifestyle throughout Europe to the tune of 17,000 monasteries. Imagine that for a moment. 17,000 monasteries throughout Europe. So for many then, ministry in the church, for the monks, what is ministry? Ministry then is what it is that you do in the monastery. What is your job in the monastery? That now becomes a ministry. So how interesting that we would have ministries like the hebdomadarian. The hebdomadarian, who's that? That's the person who's going to lead us in prayer, and that is his or her ministry, to lead us in prayer. We have ministries like the porter. Who's the porter? The porter is the one who gives access to our monastery, the one who keeps the keys, the one who opens the door, the one who keeps us from going out and who keeps others from coming in. So various ministries arise simply from our jobs in the monastery. We often had great liturgies in the monasteries, things like Gregorian chant. We've heard of that. How interesting, as part of these reforms. Gregorian chant then was a way for all of us to be singing together. Wouldn't it be nice if we praised the Lord in song? Imagine if all of us had ways to be able to record music, to be able to see how it is that we could all be singing together. We also celebrated private masses. How interesting that during this movement of these 17,000 monasteries throughout Europe, sort of the model for liturgy was these great monastic liturgies on the one hand, and also private masses. If we are monks living together as priests, for instance, what happens when we have this idea that we are offering the sacrifice of the cross, celebrating Christ's sacrifice, then we're going to have the practice of private masses, so that each priest in the monastery can celebrate his own private mass. What before for us was a celebration of all of us breaking bread together, now during the monastic period, when there are various priests, we have to answer a question. Are we going to celebrate the Mass together? Or are we going to celebrate our own masses? In the monastic lifestyle then, there was a multiplication then of private masses. The Christian life at that time was seen less in terms of mission, not so much going out and evangelizing others, because a vow of stability didn't allow us to do that, to go outside the walls. We were, for the most part as monks, we were cloistered. We lived in a cloister. We lived behind walls. We were cloistered. So it wasn't about going out and preaching to people. The monastic life was focusing on prayer and work. Ora et labora, we called it. We're going to focus on our life together, praying together, and working together, not going out and evangelizing others outside the walls, so much as praying for the world from inside the walls. So the values that are going to be emphasized are going to be values of detachment from the world, separating ourselves from the world, fleeing from the world. The value of contemplation and prayer, and also of the Mass and the sacraments, because if we have priests within our walls, then we can be celebrating Mass and the sacraments. How interesting, as part of this move then, the monk popes were imposing this life of the monks on others. Another aspect of the monastic prayer then was saying the Divine office. The divine office then was the way that the monks prayed 8 times a day. In order to pray 8 times a day then, the monks were praying the Psalms, which means that we need to have written resources. And so in the monasteries, we copied Scripture and we copied the Psalms and we copied the prayers that we would do. And every time we founded a new monastery, what would we do? We would send out copies of those prayers so that all of us were praying the same prayers throughout all of Europe. We were praying the divine office, gathering to pray as monks or as nuns 8 times a day. The books then that we developed, we called them breviaries. The breviary then was made to contain all of those prayers that monks said during the course of a week. And it's during this period that the breviary, the praying of the breviary, or the praying of the divine office, is mandated on all clergy in the church. So if you serve the church as a member of the clergy, even if you're not a monk, you must pray like the monks pray. You must pray the divine office. You must pray the breviary, we called it. So the breviary was imposed on secular clergy in addition to monks and religious. And it was imposed under pain of mortal sin. Mortal sin, what does that mean? That if you don't pray the divine office, if you don't pray the breviary, what's the belief? That you are going to hell. It is a mortal sin not to pray the divine office if you are a member of the clergy. And so the breviary was imposed on clergy under pain of mortal sin. Clerics at that time also began imitating monastic dress. And so think about some of the forms of clerical dress that we've seen, for instance, with various cassocks, right? Where did these trends first grow up of clergy dressing in uniform ways that reflected the monastery? From these monks, right? When you have 24 popes and 200 cardinals and 1,600 bishops, all of these coming out of monasteries, they dressed in a certain way in the monastery. And so it's only, they had their uniform in the monastery. Now in the secular world, among secular clergy, it just seems that we would have uniforms as well. Something that identifies us in the same way that the monks' habits identified them. The final monasticization of the life, though, according to Paul Bernier, the final monasticization of the life of secular priests, though, was the imposition of celibacy. The monks lived a celibate life. The question arose, why should all priests not live a celibate life? How interesting, because now that we're imposing celibacy throughout the West in this Western axis of power with these 1,700 monasteries, we're imposing celibacy on secular clergy. Was that the case in the East, in Constantinople, and in the Eastern Church, the Orthodox or regular Catholic Church? No, celibacy was never mandated in the same way, which is why celibacy became one of the 3 issues over which the split in 1054 was to occur. The Western Church was mandating celibacy. The Eastern Church said this is not acceptable. This is not part of our tradition in the church. The church was not founded on a celibate man. Peter had a mother-in-law, so presumably Peter was a married man. We've had a married secular clergy for all of these centuries, and now you're mandating celibacy? That is not acceptable. That was one of the 3 reasons over which the East-West split, or the East-West schism, would occur when the Roman Church was excommunicated in 1054. So it's interesting how it is that during this time period then, we have the monasteries greatly influencing life in the church, from the divine office to the imposition of celibacy to clerical clothing to liturgical forms. It's just this, how it is that it's, as Paul Bernier says, the monasticization of the church. How it is that the church is going to become more and more like the monasteries, reflecting the values learned by these monks and nuns in the 17,000 monasteries that we had throughout Europe in the midst of all that's happening here now, we have these interesting relationships between church and state. Why? We remember again that power comes from one or two places: organized people and or organized money. So we have the power of the state, organizing people and organizing money, for instance, through taxes. We also have organized power in the church. So the state and the church are two big powers, and we're about to see what it is that's happening during this period. So in this period from 500 to 1054 then, we have this time of these feudal systems where priests are going to be more dependent on their feudal lords and on the proprietors of the lands than they are on their own bishops. Think about that for a moment. So if you're a priest, you're depending on the generosity of those who are allowing you a place to live and are allowing you to serve in that area. So in many places then, the priests would be more closely connected to their feudal lords than they would to their own bishops. After the Roman emperor fled to Constantinople in 476, there was no central government in Italy outside of the bishops. And so how interesting, once there's this vacuum of power, the emperor has now gone to Constantinople, so there's a vacuum of power here in Rome. And so who are those who are in leadership positions? Who are those who have organized people and or money and who have power in Italy, in present-day Italy? That would be the bishops. And so jurisdiction soon starts to overshadow ministry and ordination. How do you keep bishops from fighting? Excellent question. I've got an idea. What if you're to give each bishop his own jurisdiction, his own diocese, let's call it. So we have various jurisdictions springing up, and the bishop then is in charge of his own diocese, exercising jurisdiction then in his jurisdiction. Interesting, it's during this time then that we have bishops who are dividing up territory. But did the bishops actually do the work? They were bishops. They were enjoying the power that they had, and they had others doing the work for them. What was the word that we came up with during this period for the people who did the work for them? They're vicars. So today, every diocese has a vicar. What does the vicar do? The vicar does the real work. While the bishop is like the Queen of England, the face, the person who is out in public ceremonies, it's really the vicars who are like the prime minister dealing with the various challenges as they arise in any given diocese. So jurisdiction was what was now seen as guaranteeing the validity of priestly actions. If you wanted to serve as a priest within one of those jurisdictions, what happened? You were under a certain bishop. How interesting that in the same way that civil society had a hierarchy, we were creating a hierarchy where priests were subject to bishops. Bishops, then if you were a priest in a certain jurisdiction, then you were responsible to the head of that jurisdiction, who was the bishop. The emphasis during this time period shifts to the ex operato effects of the sacraments, essentially meaning that the sacraments have to be given by duly designated ministers. And if they come from duly designated ministers, regardless of how holy or not those ministers are, then those sacraments are valid. So, if you are a priest in a certain jurisdiction and you have faculties from a bishop, if you are duly designated, or today the word that we use is that you have faculties, the bishop has given you faculties to perform the sacraments or to preach. So if you are a priest and you have faculties, then you are designated, you are duly designated to preach and to share the sacraments, and any sacrament that you share, ex operato, what does that mean? It simply means that if you are duly designated, then your sacraments are valid. Think about the result of this new theology in the church. So it doesn't matter how holy or not you are. It doesn't matter how you live your life. If you are duly designated, then your sacraments are valid. So what's the focus? That you be duly designated. That you have faculties. That you be under a bishop. That you be obedient. Obedience of priests to bishops, such that the bishops had the power and the priests received from those bishops their faculties, their ability to celebrate the sacraments. They were designated by the bishops. If I wanted to be a priest in a jurisdiction, in order to validly give sacraments, now it has nothing to do with the sacrament itself. It's that I have to be duly designated as a priest by a bishop. What a fascinating shift that was. And so the appointment to a position was presumed to give a person the qualities or the charisms needed for the job. If I were to become a priest, for instance, then the belief was that God will give me the gifts that I need to be a priest. If I'm consecrated a bishop, God will give me the gifts necessary to be able to do my job as a bishop. That appointment to that position brings with it the gifts for that position. Is that necessarily true? It was certainly the theology at that time, right? That by being consecrated a bishop, you now have the charism or the qualities for being a bishop. Interesting. So bishops mainly exercised jurisdiction then. The vicars did the actual work, and it was the vicars then who supervised the clergy, which is why in many dioceses even today we have the term vicar forain or the vicar of clergy. What happens then? Does the bishop directly supervise the priests? No. The bishop has someone to stand in his place. The vicar from the Latin word meaning to stand in one's place, right? The vice president comes from the same root. The vicar is the vice bishop, if you will, who stands in the bishop's place, connecting, serving the priests and overseeing the priests in the name of the bishop. All of these were new structures in the church. Do we see that? So the structure that we have today of bishops and their vicars, does that date itself back to Christ? That dates itself to this time period in the church, the feudal church. Back at this time then, the duties of priests became more liturgical and less pastoral. Think about it. The model is our praying for the church, the divine office of the bereaved, our celebrating Mass, then our ministry as priests, it's less about getting out and serving the poor. It's more about my job, my responsibility of praying for your needs, either through the divine office, praying my breviary, and or by celebrating the Mass and the sacraments. Rural churches, how interesting. So we had these bishops who were the head of jurisdictions, but we also know that there were feudal lords at this time who owned the land. So what happens if you're in a jurisdiction that has a bishop, but you're living within the territory of a feudal lord? Suddenly you have a challenge. To whom do you report? To the bishop and or to the feudal lord? The feudal lords then, as we can imagine, had a great deal of power over the priests who served on their lands, which simply meant that there had to be this relationship where the priest knew that he had to get along with the feudal lord in order to serve there, but also there was this connection to the bishop as well that could not be overlooked. And in rural places, many of those rural churches were more controlled by the local lords, the feudal lords, than they were by the bishops. In many places, bishops became less attached to their dioceses, which is why we remember that the Council of Nicaea said that all bishops are wedded to their dioceses. So if you're a bishop, that is your diocese until you die. That is your diocese. And if you move from one diocese to another, what did the Council of Nicaea say? It said, if one bishop moves from a diocese to another, he is an adulterer. An adulterer, like one who cheats on his wife? How fascinating. Let's take the example here in Austin, Texas. Monsignor Michael Siss previously served as the vicar for Bishop Jose Vasquez of the Roman Church. So we have bishops, and the bishop has his vicar. Bishop Vasquez had his vicar, Monsignor Cis, whom many of us know and love. And being a vicar is often a proving ground for future bishops, right? Within this power structure that the Roman Church has set up, we often promote from within. So being a vicar is the testing ground. So Monsignor Cis was the vicar overseeing the challenges here in the Diocese of Austin, but then he was named bishop of another place. Interesting. What would the Council of Nicaea what did the Council of Nicaea say? That Monsignor Cis is an adulterer. Monsignor Cis is like an unfaithful husband. The Council of Nicaea declared that anyone who leaves his diocese for the diocese of another is an adulterer. In the Middle Ages, the Patriarch of Rome consolidated his power over political power. So how interesting that the Patriarch here in Rome was consolidating his power. Now that there was this vacuum of power, the power had gone off to Constantinople, how it is that the bishops and those who are under the Patriarch of Rome are consolidating their power. They're growing in their power. By the 5th century, Pope Gelasius, who was the Bishop of Rome, the Patriarch of Rome, Pope Gelasius claimed spiritual power over all other bishops. We all can see where that's going to go. In the ancient church, all bishops were equals. They were all overseers, but then some started to rise in prominence, including the patriarchs of the church, the patriarchs of Rome and of Alexandria and of Jerusalem and of Antioch and later of Constantinople. So these bishops rose in prominence, so that by the 5th century, Pope Gelasius in Rome, the Bishop of Rome, we didn't use the term Pope yet, but the Patriarch of Rome, Gelasius, was claiming spiritual power over all other bishops. Do we see what's happening here? In this hierarchy, which is the church, he raised himself up from the level of bishops then, putting himself over the bishops as Patriarch of Rome. So the Patriarch was over the bishops, who were over the priests, etc., in this hierarchy that we were setting up. Gregory the Great, whom we've talked about, Gregory the First then, who was Pope from 590 to 604, provided the theological basis for the Bishop of Rome being all over the other bishops. He said, "To all who know the gospel, it is obvious that by the voice of the Lord, the care of the entire church was committed to the holy apostle and prince of the apostles, Peter." Interesting. So the care of the Lord, Jesus gave the care of the church to Peter. So if Jesus gave the care of the church to Peter, Pope Gregory continues, certainly in honor of Peter, the prince of the apostles, the title universal was offered to the Roman pontiff by the Venerable Council of Chalcedon. So interesting. So now the Bishop of Rome is getting this universal title, meaning that he now is believing that if Peter then was believed to be the head of the church in Rome, which we know today is not the case, but that being the belief at that time that Peter was the head of the church in Rome, then if Christ entrusted the church to Peter, what does that mean then? That the care of the entire church is entrusted to Peter's successor, who is the Bishop of Rome. That argument came to us from Gregory the Great. What position did he have in the church? Oh, how convenient. He was the Bishop of Rome. How convenient that he would be telling us how it is that he should be over the church in the same way that Peter was over the other apostles and was the one upon whom the church was founded. Fascinating. Along with all of this, there's also this movement with more frequent confessions over in Ireland. So in the British Isles, in Ireland, we had this greater sense of guilt in Ireland than in other places. So we went to confession more often. And we saw the priests, when we went to confession, what was happening? We saw the priests as forgiving our sins. So how interesting. Previously, confession was something that we only did once in a lifetime and only to a bishop. But now, priests, with this sense of guilt that we had in Ireland, priests were hearing confessions, and priests were seen as having the power to open the gates of heaven to us or to close them on us. How it is that priests could forgive sins, or, to use the language of the Bible, to forgive sins or to hold them bound. Gregory the Great formalized many of the structures within the church, including the sacramentaries that he wrote, so that Mass would be celebrated the same way throughout all of those parts that were under his jurisdiction. So he wrote sacramentaries. He came up with various theologies of ministry, how it is that the priest is the sole mediator between the people and God. So here it is, the priest standing between God and the people. Got news for you, people. How can you people be connected with God? There's one way. The mediator is the priest. The priest stands between you and God. Gregory also had the theology that the priest is the sole agent in the sacraments. So who does the sacraments? When we gather for Eucharist, is it us celebrating the Eucharist? Gregory the Great or Gregory the First said, no, it is the priest who celebrates the sacrament. What a shift this would be for us. For those of us who used to gather to celebrate the Eucharist, to break bread and share a cup of wine together, we celebrated the Eucharist. No, not anymore, said Gregory the Great, who was the Bishop of Rome from 590 to 604. It is the priest who celebrates Mass. He is the sole agent of the sacred action in the sacraments. And if the priest is not there, got news for you, you cannot celebrate the sacrament. You cannot celebrate the Eucharist. The priest then, how interesting, celebrates Mass on behalf of the people. And so if I, a priest, am celebrating the Mass on your behalf, do you even need to be present? You don't. I can celebrate the Mass without you. Thank you very much. You can just give me the stipend right now. Imagine the abuses that are going to creep into the church here, right? Paying priests to say Masses on our behalf so that we don't even have to go to church. We just pay the priest a stipend, and the priest will say his own private Mass for my intention, because Gregory the Great told us that in the Mass, it's not about us celebrating the Eucharist, it's about the priest celebrating the Eucharist. The priest is the sole agent of the sacred action in the sacraments. Without the priest, you cannot have a sacrament, and with the priest alone, you can have a sacrament. What's going to happen then with the role of people in the liturgy, with the role of the assembly? With Gregory the Great then, if the priest is the sole agent in the sacrament then we as an assembly were reduced to silence and passive witness. For those of us who are old enough to remember the Roman Catholic Church before the 1960s, what was happening? The priest celebrated Mass. He didn't need any of us to be there. We could go and watch him, go and pray with him, but he didn't need us. He turned his back to us, and he celebrated the Mass with or without us. We were there as passive witnesses, praying with him or praying our own rosary or doing whatever it was that we did during Mass, but our role was now reduced. Interesting. So in the setting up of various jurisdictions then, we needed to come up with ways. So do we just have, now that we have the Patriarch of Rome over the bishops, now that there are too many bishops for the Patriarch of Rome to oversee, even with his own vicar, right? What we have is we have the establishment of lifting up various bishops above the bishops, but between the bishops and the Patriarch of Rome. What would we call them? We called them archbishops. So, for the first time in the history of the church, we see how it is that archbishops arose. How? Because these archbishops then now are between the Bishop of Rome and all of the other bishops. And the one sign that they have of connection with the Bishop of Rome is that they wear the pallium. The pallium, if you ever see pictures of the Pope, the pallium is It goes over the neck of the Pope, and it has various crosses on it. The pallium is made out of wool, and is a symbol of how it is. If it's made out of wool, it comes from a sheep, right? The good shepherd carries the sheep on his shoulders, so it's a symbol of the bishop being a good shepherd and following in the footsteps of Christ. But if the Bishop of Rome wears that, then the placing of the pallium on the bishop now becomes a symbol of obedience to the Bishop of Rome. Got news for you. You were a bishop. I'm willing to raise you up in this hierarchy to be an archbishop, we'll call you, but you must promise obedience to me. And the symbol of that is that you will dress in the same way as me, wearing a pallium. That pallium means that you represent me, and it is a symbol of your obedience to me as the Bishop of Rome. So, the archbishops then at this time are made agents of the Pope and wear this symbol of unity with the Pope, which we know of as the pallium. Interesting, because now we can soon start calling the Pope during this period the Pope. Before he was the Bishop of Rome, or later the Patriarch of Rome, but now that the Patriarch of Rome is lifting himself up above all others, soon we're coming into this idea of the Pope and of the papacy. And so, for instance, 774, if we're following along all of these dates here, in 774, the Papal States seceded from the Empire. So we had the Empire, and the Papal States now that the Pope is in control of, in 774, divides itself from the rest of the Empire and is subject to the Bishop of Rome, who by now, in 774, has the title of Pope. So now we have the Pope with the Pope's Papal States. How interesting that these are now not part of the Roman Empire. Who's the sovereign ruler of the Papal States then? That would be the Pope. Whose face is going to be on the money in the Papal States? Interesting. The Pope. The Pope now ruled over what had come to be known as the patrimony of St. Peter. Again, the ancient tradition, even though Peter was over in this part of the world, Jerusalem, perhaps even later in Antioch, according to one tradition, how interesting that Rome is going to claim that this was where Peter was the patrimony of Peter, and so that the Bishop of Rome, following the footsteps of Peter, had control over all others in the church in their estimation. We have now, as part of this entire movement, we also have a time where canon law is now going to divide the church into two categories. Canon law is going to say there are two types of people in this world. There are clergy, those who are ordained to ministry in the church. And if you are not clergy, what is canon law going to call you? Laity. You are either clergy ordained to ministry in the church, or you are laity. You are a layperson. That distinction we see in canon law for the first time during this feudal period from 500 to 1054. The Neoplatonic spirit of Pseudo-Dionysius suggested that the higher state possesses in a higher way what the lower state possesses in a limited way. This was all part of the metaphysics of the good. So Pseudo-Dionysius was a pseudonymous work. We don't know who wrote it, but the author was Dionysius, and we later came to believe that it wasn't Dionysius, so we called it Pseudo-Dionysius. So Pseudo-Dionysius had this theory of the metaphysics of the good, where the good is like a cup of coffee that spills over. So if the cup of coffee spills over, it first spills onto the saucer, and then if it keeps spilling, it spills over onto the table. If it keeps spilling, it spills over onto the floor. And the farther away it gets from the cup of coffee, the colder it gets, right? Isn't that true then, Dionysius said, with the nature of the good, with a capital G, as well? How it is that the farther you get away from the top, the less holy you get. Interesting. So the Pope at the top, in this model of this trickle-down economy of grace. The Pope receives the grace. He's closest to Christ, closest to God. And then it trickles down, and the farther down the hierarchy you go, the less holy, the less grace you have, the less holy you are. So how interesting. The pseudo-Dionysius was used to justify this, that the farther you get down in the hierarchy, by the time you get down to the laity, how holy are the laity? Definitely not as holy as the clergy, right? Because the clergy are closer to God. The farther you get down from God, the Pope is the holiest of all, and then there's this trickle-down economy of grace, where the closer you are to God, the more grace you have. The farther from God you are, the less grace you have. In a contemporary theology of grace, of course, this is hard to hold. How can you say that one person has more grace? Is grace something you can measure? How do you measure grace? How do you say that one person has more grace than another person? The episcopate, how interesting, was seen as the fullness of priesthood. Think of the problems with this notion. Here are the priests at one rung of the hierarchy. The bishops, what are bishops? They simply enjoy the fullness of the priesthood. Well, what does that mean then? If Archbishop Johnson, as an archbishop, has the fullness of priesthood, what does this mean about, say, Father Jamie or any other priest? Is Father Jamie not fully a priest? How interesting that during this time period we see this theology arise of how it is that bishops enjoy the fullness of the priesthood. They enjoy the priesthood in a way that is more full than others. As if priests somehow are not fully priests. Bishops enjoy the fullness of the priesthood. That's a concept that dates to this feudal time period from 500 to 1054. Where it's this view, this model of the world where all power comes from above, right? All grace comes from God above and all power comes from above in this hierarchy, fueling this hierarchical development of the church and this hierarchical orders that were considered apostolic. That this is the way that Christ intended the church to be, and this is the way that Christ gives grace to the church, beginning at the top of the pyramid and trickling down using the pseudo-Dionysian metaphysics of the good. Imagine the thinking that results in then, where all power comes from above. If all power comes from above, what does that mean for priests? Priests cannot act outside of the power of their bishops. Bishops have power over priests. Bishops and archbishops, wait a minute, archbishops have power over bishops. The Pope has power over archbishops. How interesting. All power comes from above in such a hierarchical model. That model then is a result of this feudal period of the church from 500 to 1054, when the East would split from the West. We had this model of power coming down the hierarchy in this waterfall, if you will, of which was this trickle-down economy of grace in the church.